Thank you for joining today's board governance webinar focusing on the board's role in GenAI. I'm Ron Hudak, Senior Manager for Deloitte Center for Board Effectiveness. Today's session is being recorded. You can earn CPE credits for participating in today's session. To receive credit, be sure to answer the polling questions and stay on the webinar for a minimum of 50 minutes. Please note that on your screen is the Q&A tool. You can use the Q&A tool to enter a question for our speakers at any time by typing in your question and hitting enter. Also, feel free to use the Q&A tool if you are having issues answering the polling questions. Now, please welcome your host for today's meeting, Managing Partner for Deloitte Center for Board Effectiveness and Vice Chair for Audit and Regulatory, Christine Devine. Christine, you may begin.
Thank you, Ron, and welcome everyone. As Ron said, I am the leader of our Center for Board Effectiveness. And thank you so much for joining this last session of our 2024 Board Governance webinar series. Today's discussion is on the board's role in GenAI. I think this is probably our most highly anticipated webinar of this year's series. I attribute that to just how relevant this topic is to boards as they're thinking about their oversight responsibility and their governance responsibilities for GenAI. Ron mentioned that you get CPE if you answer the 4 polling questions, if you'd like that, if you're a CPA out there like myself. And with that in mind, I'm going to start with a polling question. The polling question is, what topics do you expect your boards to be most focused on in 2025? Select all that apply, please. And while the poll is being tabulated and before we see the results, I am going to go ahead and introduce our moderator, Lara Abrash. And Lara is the chair of Deloitte US. And it is an immense pleasure for me to introduce Lara, who I've worked very closely with throughout my entire career, really, at Deloitte. And prior to Lara being our US Deloitte chair, she was the CEO and chair of our audit and assurance practice. And she has a long history of serving some of our most distinguished clients. And as chair, one of Lara's platforms in her focus area is around governance of GenAI. So there is no one better suited today to moderate this panel. So with that, Lara, let me turn it right over to you.
Well, great, Christine, and it's great to be with all of you today. I'm super excited you've been able to join us for this really important session. This is a really appropriate time to start having this conversation. You know, we are living in a world right now where the advances in technology is like nothing we've ever seen before. We talk a lot about the Industrial Revolution and what occurred over that period of time. That is like a snail's pace compared to the types of things that we're seeing relative to how technology is being infused into business, into politics, into our daily lives. And ultimately, it excites me and energizes me to think that so many of us are in a position where we can be part of helping this amazing technology thrive, ultimately. But it comes with a responsibility, and part of the responsibility sits in the core of our boardroom. You know, we've already seen, when we talk about generative AI, we've already seen amazing things that have come from it. If you merely look at the pandemic and think about the amount of time it took leveraging generative AI to find the vaccines that ultimately provided to be a cure for COVID, you realize weeks and days and hours meant so much. And that's a period that we're in right now. So the opportunities are immense. And I think for all of us, it comes with great excitement. But what I try to think about in this space is I ultimately try to think about what's sitting in front of us. How will people down the road think about this? When you look 50, 100, 150 years, and you look back, just the way we look at the Industrial Revolution, just the way we look at other very relevant parts of our history of this wonderful earth that we sit in, our own country that we sit in, we often look back as historians and talk about, you know, did they make the right decisions? And I think about with the immense opportunity that generative AI and these other technologies offer, there will equally be people looking back, future generations looking back at us, and they'll be looking to say, did we make all the right choices with what we had in front of us? They're gonna wonder, did we move too fast? did we move too fast because we were afraid? Did we move too fast because we were greedy and didn't want to lose pace? Did we really balance all the things that we need to be thinking about, which is what we're going to talk about today? And I think we need to think about that as we start to embark on the governance of Gen AI, the execution by management teams and driving strategy, and how it'll touch all of our human beings on this earth every day. And when I think about it, it ultimately comes in two forms. It comes with great responsibility to make sure that the technology is creating a world that we want to live in, a world that's better than the world we live in today. And it means that we're creating less societal harm that we have today. We're not creating more biases. We're not creating more harm to the earth. And then ultimately, it's really important that we think about how this will affect all the human beings that live here. And there is a temptation already, you see this by so many, to take this great technology and start talking about it as a productivity tool. And with a productivity tool becomes a tool to essentially eliminate jobs. And I want to encourage all of us as we have these conversations, and I'm sure we'll talk about it today, to think about something that's human-centric. There is a need for human beings to have meaning and purpose. So much of that comes from the work we do. So eliminating work for everyone will not be great. We also need to think about where will and who would likely be affected. Are we actually putting people that are already in harm's way, in deeper harm's way, because they may be the first ones to ultimately be affected? And we need to think about how do we bring the specialness of what human beings bring to the technology as almost like a co-pilot, that ultimately we're superpowering the technology with the things we bring, the creativity, the entrepreneurship that we bring, the way we have emotional quotient that's going to be different from technology. So we've got to really think about all that, but it does come with great responsibility. And there comes the boardroom. We're in the early stages. We, in our own organization at Deloitte, we did a survey recently, a global boardroom survey. We included 500 board members across 60 countries, asking them about generative AI, and some of the results were pretty interesting. We found out that it's complicated relative to how many people are actually spending time in the boardrooms in the way they'd like. There is clearly a desire to spend more time on generative AI. Board members want to enhance the knowledge and experience that they have. They want to make sure they're focused on the management team accelerating the pace of adoption to make sure that they're not losing pace. And that was pretty much uniform. But again, as you go a little deeper, 45% of the people who responded said this topic is not yet on the board agenda. Half of the respondents agreed that they would like to see it, and they'd like to see themselves spending more time on the oversight of Gen AI, and that there was a consensus that it should be prioritized. 35% said they've yet to adopt Gen AI in their organizations, and 44% of them said they need to accelerate the pace. What you're going to hear from these panelists today is that generative AI is likely across almost every organization a board member sits. Enterprise softwares are already providing generative AI. So even if the company themselves haven't developed specific company use cases and technologies, it is very unlikely that generative AI is not already being used by the organizations that boards are governing. And the topics themselves are different than the topics we've had in the past. This is core to the responsibility of a board. A board ultimately has responsibility for being stewards of an organization, representing the shareholders, and making sure the choices that are being made are driving the long-term strategy of an organization. And when you think about these technologies, they're going to be core to the success of the long term, not just in a cost play, but ultimately in a top line play. They also have the potential for disruption or disintermediation. And boards need to make sure they understand both the potential benefits of generative AI, as well as the potential harm that could be offered if it doesn't allow a business model of one of their organizations to operate because it gets disintermediated in a certain way. That means we all need to be educated as board members. We don't all need to be data scientists, but we all need to understand the technology sufficiently. And we have a responsibility to defend the brand and also manage and mitigate the risks. Again, as you'll hear today, those look very different with this technology than with others. When I think about a board operating at its very best, a 10 out of 10, they ultimately are doing three things. They're very focused on hindsight, and then insight, and then foresight. Hindsight is ultimately the core of the stewardship of a board, making sure the board is focused on the day-to-day needs of governance. It's executing its fiduciary responsibility. Insight is when the mosaic of the individual board members bring perspectives to a management team that goes beyond what the management team may be able to see within its own organizational walls because of other places you all sit. But foresight is where generative AI and advancing technologies come in. That is when the board is looking around the corner and truly thinking about 5 to 10 to 15 years, horizon 2, 3 type of thinking. And that is what's going to be necessary as we govern the generative AI. We need to be thinking about it both in the days of today and what we know, but we need to be thinking about the implications to an organization, how it operates, how its workforce evolves, and how ultimately the mosaic of who does the work will change. It's going to be fundamentally a huge responsibility on boards because we ultimately have the main responsibility around foresight. So it is really a super exciting time. So what I'd like to do now is get ourselves into the panel. I have two great panelists. I'm going to have them both give you a little bit of their own background, and then we're going to get started into some questions. So I'm going to start with you, Bina. So Bina Anamanth, joining us from Deloitte. Why don't you give us a little bit of your background? You'll see the polling questions are also coming up, and then I'll introduce our next panelist.
Thanks, Lara. So I'm Bina Amanat. I lead our global Deloitte AI Institute, which really looks at the applied AI side of things. When AI is applied in the real world across industries, what are the nuances that come with it? Ethics, risks are all important, but also looking at the impact on the workforce and talent, the kind of new skill sets that's needed. So we look holistically and do research on the applied AI across industries. And I work closely with Lara on the work that we do with boards.
Perfect. Thank you, Bina. And then Carolyn Say, why don't you introduce yourself, and then we'll just get started here.
Thank you
Welcome.
so much, Sarah, and thank you for the Deloitte team to have me here today. I'm Caroline Say, and I'm from Silicon Valley, have worked for large tech companies like IBM, Yahoo, and HPE, started and led my own venture capital-backed company, and currently serve on the boards of the Coca-Cola Company and Morningstar. I'm on both audit committees, as well as NomGov with Morningstar, and super excited to be here and to be speaking about this topic.
Great. Well, thank you, Bina. Thank you, Carolyn. And a reminder to all of our folks tuning in here, if you've got questions that you want to make sure you get addressed here, please use the chat feature. They'll be coming to me to offer to our panelists here. But maybe we'll start with you, Bina. GenAI has been increasing rapidly, as you know, over the past few years. Can you give us an overview from your perspective, how the landscape has evolved? And when you think most recently, where do you see it today? Could you share a little bit on your perspective of the arc of generative AI? There's a lot of hype, but I'd love to hear your perspective of where we are today.
So as AI as a terminology has existed since 1956, right? What GenAI did in late 2022 was to make it mainstream, to make it accessible to the average person who didn't need any technical knowledge, any knowledge in computer science to access this very powerful tool. In 2024, today, this past year, what we're seeing is there are several GenAI enabled tools available with existing solutions. We are seeing more and more organizations moving from experimenting with GenAI in POCs to scaling those use cases that have the potential to transform an entire function using just GenAI. We are seeing the development of AI agents and multi-agent systems. These really capitalize on the capabilities of GenAI, creating very powerful systems that can plan, reason, connected tools and data, and complete complicated workflows. So very exciting opportunities and advancements in GenAI.
So when you think about the opportunities that, maybe you could just talk a little bit about what are the challenges you're seeing most companies presented with?
Yeah, so the opportunities are at a high level are in a few categories. One is to enhance human productivity, drive greater access and visibility into enterprise data, and new efficiencies across workflows. The challenges are to identify where and which Gen AI enabled tools to use, what risks they come with, to make strategic decisions on building Gen AI applications and alliances and new partnerships, to really balance the costs of experimenting with Gen AI with the business ROI and the outcomes that's needed, and the evolving landscape of AI regulations and the compliance needs that will come as AI regulations come into play.
That's super helpful. Maybe just go a little deeper on what I shared, if you could. What's already happening in organizations relative to enterprise software? Are you seeing, I sort of allude that I think almost every company actually has Gen AI, some form or another, with the enterprise software. What you were talking about probably gets to a little bit more company specific. What's actually happening when you think about I'm going to say, quote unquote, off the shelf softwares that most companies are using?
So there is a lot of maturity that's coming. What we've seen earlier in the year was a number of startups really, pushing the limits on Gen AI and putting out tools and solutions, but not necessarily having the robustness that's needed to work in a large enterprise. Now, what we're seeing is the more advanced software companies putting out products that are very much robust, fueled by Gen AI, that is usable out of the box compared to before, where there were much more customization that was needed.
Okay, perfect. Well, I'm going to pivot to you, Carolyn. So when you think about, from a board perspective, where do you think boards are today in their oversight journey? And what have you observed relative to how the discussions and priorities have evolved? Obviously, I shared a little bit of our survey data, but I'd love to hear it from you on the ground.
Yeah, and Lara, I did see that study before even preparing for this panel, so it's not it's totally in line with the observations I've seen. But the companies are at different stages of maturity in the Gen AI oversight journey, depending on the board members themselves, the company, the services and products that they are in, as well as the industries that they're in. I think the acceleration, though, around the priorities has really been because of the regulation and policies, like you've seen with the EU AI Privacy or AI Act, as well as what certain states have attempted to do or have put in place. But also the fact that there's greater recognition by CEOs and leaders that AI can actually drive business value in addition to productivity and efficiency gains, right? And Bina, you mentioned scale. I think many companies are still early in their kind of trials, piloting, doing small innovation projects with Gen AI. So it will take some time to get to that scale. But I think this will move quickly as boards recognize that, we can deliver significant and meaningful business value from these use cases and this technology.
What you shared is a lot of what I also see, Caroline. I also see the differences are coming. If you're at a tech company, when I talk to executives or board members of tech companies, the conversations are completely different. If I'm talking to a consumer product, manufacturing, it may be a little different. We had another webinar with the chair of auto manufacturer who was using Internet of Things and AI in the vehicles, and they were in a very different place. So it is wide ranging, but there is a desire for more on the off the shelf technologies, again, because you'd mentioned HP and all the places you've been. I mean, let's be honest, you've got Microsoft, Salesforce, all of them are investing and implementing in AI. I mean, it's already coming into organizations. Whether they're actually leveraging all the tools is a different question, but it's available.
Exactly.
Okay, great. Well, we have a polling question that I'm going to ask you to keep your CPE going here. How often do your boards discuss generative AI? If you guys want to address that, and then while we're doing that, I'll move us on to our next question here. Hold on. Sorry, I can't see the question, so I'm just going to move this out of the way. It'll eventually go. So maybe we'll just go back to a little bit of the education and board engagement process. maybe Caroline, I'll stick with you on this. What are you seeing relative to how boards are thinking about the education process, as well as they think about sitting a board? There was a point in time that boards thought about the financial expert they needed for the audit committee, the cyber expert they needed. Now you're starting to look at disciplines. You have ESG. Do we need someone who understands carbon emissions? We had the technology expert, which I'm sure you get to fulfill that role as well. Are you seeing boards from a mosaic thinking about, do I need a specific type of board member? And or what are you seeing relative to education of boards, and any advice on those that are on this call, how to get started in the education process?
Yeah, well, quite frankly, I'm not seeing enough or very much. There is still a reliance, just being the sole or main kind of tech board member with my boards, right? Leaning toward the expertise and background that I might have to be able to support management and the board discussions, whether it's in the general board meetings or the audit committee and other committees around this topic. But I think, in terms of education, there's so much access out there and so many, tools and curricula. This panel, for example, you can just even go to Coursera for free and learn about GenAI in a very easy and consumable way. There are consortiums and forums with Stanford and Stanford Continuing Studies, as well as many universities out there that offer curriculum, and of course NACD, right? Recent introductions around certifications, and I think Northern California in particular is doing a great job with education around this topic too. So I think there's a lot more that could be done to build up the skill set and experiences. And on the topic of board selection and succession, I would say it's one of those skill sets where it's part of a broader range of skill sets, right, that board members are looking for. I don't think that boards are necessarily saying, hey, we need an AI specific expert, because there also aren't that many given the new advancements over the last few years. But looking at it as part of a broader discussion around technology backgrounds.
And one of the things piece of advice I had been given recently by a board member, and who's also a sitting executive, is the best way for boards to ultimately understand the power is to get them hands-on experience. So their advice was, if you're at an organization where you believe the management team actually has the capabilities to do it, have them come in and demo how generative AI is actually, even if it's in a pilot mode, has the potential. Because seeing it, what they would say, at least this individual said to me, was one of the most powerful ways to see the power.
That's a really good point. For our business reviews and updates, we highly encourage the management leaders to showcase what it is they're doing and demo products or any kinds of tooling that they're using, because you don't get that kind of aha and understanding moment until you see something like that.
Well, maybe while we're sticking with boards, and then we'll get back to you, Bina, we've got the results of our polling question here. It says, it's actually pretty interesting. About 40% would say that GenAI is done more informally as an ad hoc topic, but 20% said it's a conversation at every meeting, and then you could see semi-annually, and on the lower side, the not discussed or not applicable. Any reactions to this, Caroline or Bina?
I agree with the poll. I've seen the whole variety of where where you have it on a regular basis. It all depends on where the organization is in their AI journey, depending on how advanced they are, how many POCs have they done, where are they looking more at scaling, where they are looking at it more from a board oversight and risk perspective. So it's across the spectrum, I would say. On the poll results very much align with what I'm observing.
Yeah, and I would say one question or one option I didn't see is whether it's its own topic versus embedded in, the different topics or work that's being done across the organization. I typically have seen with respect to the broader board meetings that GenAI is really kind of one use case or aspect of the business reviews and updates kind of across the board versus its own topic, where you might see that when you're talking about risks, say in audit. Right, so I'm kind of curious to see whether the question is really centered around it being kind of its own topic, or if it's really spread.
If you were actually pivoting me to the thing I wanted to ask Bina about, because I did have a board chair say to me, you shouldn't talk about GenAI as its own topic. We think about it as a tool. And so we ultimately have our integrated strategy, and it's an enabler to our strategy. So maybe, Bina, I'll talk to you. Strategy is the heart of the board's responsibility. That's one of the core things we have a responsibility around. What advice would you give boards as they evaluate this integrated strategy to ensure that GenAI is appropriately overseen?
Yeah, no, I agree with you. Strategy is at the heart of the board's responsibility, and boards can really emphasize to the executive team the strategic importance of building a Gen AI ready organization, be the catalyst to get Gen AI into the organization, whether it is about focusing on the data strategy and compliance aspect, talent acquisition, and skill set development, keeping pace with competitors while also being able to bring the greatest potential in efficiency, cost reduction, productivity enhancement. Lara, the other big thing is really thinking about this tool as an innovation trigger to build new products, new capabilities, new services, and even entirely new business models or revenue opportunities in the organization. I think boards can serve to be a huge catalyst. While the management focuses on Gen AI execution, boards can now contemplate on how the AI use cases or scale deployments may impact all the other aspects of the business, from the workforce, the enterprise reputation, societal implications. The priority is really to innovate and deploy, but in a sustainable long-term value. And boards can really take that strategic approach.
Yeah, so and maybe Caroline, I will then pivot to you, because you started to lead with this. How do you see these boards focused on strategy? And then maybe we could pivot into the responsibilities that you see that are different relative to governing Gen AI. Like, what are the different risks that organizations are thinking about that boards are should be focused on? Like, where are the delineations of new types of opportunities and implications coming from generative AI? And how do you see a best practice in governing that? And then if you have any commentary on the where, I get this question a lot. Is this a full board topic? Are there things that should be going to others? I'd love to hear a little bit on that as well.
Yeah, well, I think there were about 3 or 4 questions in there, so I'll try to address all of it. But the first is, in terms of the strategy, I think of Gen AI falling into kind of 3 major buckets of use cases that deliver value for a company and organization. One is the use cases around the products and services, right? Are you able to go to market and time to market around your products and services faster using Gen AI, ultimately to drive revenue growth and customer growth? The other bucket is around productivity gains. Perhaps you're using Microsoft Copilot, for example, to help the engineers be able to code a lot better or faster or easier. And then the third bucket is around operational excellence, right? So perhaps you are looking at scaling marketing campaigns across 200 markets and trying to localize the content of those campaigns. So can you do it faster, better, and in a less expensive manner? So I think that piece, right, the board should be reviewing at the board level. These are the strategic ties to the business and what the organization is doing. But I think there are lots of risks, right, that do need to be evaluated, including the skill set and the talent. Do people have the same understanding of what Gen AI or what it even is inside of the organization at all levels within the organization? Or do you need to upskill those folks or bring new talent into the organization? There are, of course, data quality, privacy issues, IP, trademark risks. Are you utilizing the right models for those right use cases? Your cost and spend, the ethical obligations, and then the alignment of AI with the organization's brand and values. I think there are many major risks to evaluate. And so far I've seen that typically start within the audit committee. Of course, this may be in a technology or innovation committee as well, and some of it, depending on the size of the risks or impact, it falls over into the broader board discussion. But I would say in terms of managing the risk, the board should be managing really the risks from what the employees can manage, right? So there are two kind of mechanisms for this. If you don't already have an incident management, a crisis response escalation path and system across the organization for business continuity issues or cybersecurity issues, in addition to AI issues, right? You better have that in place. That is one way to manage the risks and the escalation path and outcomes. And then the other piece is I've seen companies put in place AI offices or review committees that are led by management. You might have the business leaders, the technology leaders, procurement, legal, privacy, different leaders that are cross-functional leading this charge to put in place guidelines or guardrails around responsible AI implementation. They might even provide advice and approval around the types of technology and tools that are used across the organization. So there's some standardization there. All right. So I think those are two paths in which the management would be managing those risks, and ultimately the board are reviewing that.
By the way, I love the reference to the audit committee. For those of us who sit around audit committees a lot, it seems to be the dumping ground for topics that when they're not sure where it goes, it always seems to start at an audit committee. I'm sure my fellow audit committee members can appreciate that. I want to stay on though, I love the way you framed the opportunities and the things to look at. Maybe two things, advice for board members on that. I mean, I hear a lot more right now in the productivity bucket more than in the revenue bucket when I talk to clients and to board members. How do they actually start the conversation relative to making sure the management team is really being honest about the business risks that could come along with, disruption? We joke about the Kodak moment. How does a board ultimately have the wherewithal to make sure they're really beta testing the opportunities? Are they in fact the right ones? And then I'd love to get your commentary on the risk side. How does a board do this in a way that doesn't stifle innovation? And I mean, I'm going to come back to you to talk about this maybe from a management lens. But my experience, Caroline, is that, a CEO and a management team doesn't want to get at odds with a board. So if a board says, I want X, they're going to try to give them X. And so how does a board in this environment give them enough runway to take the appropriate risks on without ultimately, again, just missing the forest from the trees? So a little bit on, how do you know from a governance perspective, you're asking all the right questions around the biggest opportunities and the really biggest risk coming with GenAI, and how do you make sure you're not stifling the innovation side?
Yeah, well, two major points that are coming up in the board discussions to suss out the AI topic is really one, it is what's not working, what's not going well, right? We don't just want to see all the cool innovations and demos, but we really want to know what's not working, what is ineffective, where are we spending the money, what tools and technology are not delivering value for us. I think that's one thing that the board should be hearing about versus seeing all the kind of new flashy things, right? The other topic is around kind of the scale with which we are wanting to review or kind of step in and understand what the organization is doing. If you're talking about kind of really small innovation projects or ideas, piloting, maybe the board kind of gives the room to the management team, right? To get to the point where, hey, these ideas are starting to show meaningful scale or more meaningful impact and value to the organization. And I'll just also add too, the questions around productivity gains are there, but at the same time, there are recent studies that have been done that say that CEOs are a lot more optimistic around productivity gains than employees are. And many employees may not even necessarily know what to fill the time that they've saved up with, right? And there's, of course, upskilling and learning new technologies that need to be put in place. So I think lots of questions still around productivity gains. Example, one of my companies has been using and spending a lot of money on Microsoft Copilot licenses, but when they actually looked into usage by the employees, it just wasn't there. All right. So what is the value of signing up for these things? In terms of managing the risks, I think this again falls into the camp of audit, but making sure that even the AI review committee or AI office that I talked about with the management team, cross-functional leaders kind of being put in place to evaluate these risks and provide standards across the organization or policies across the organization, it isn't a body that gates the business, that truly does allow for room when it comes to innovation and trying different things, right? And giving it at least 6 months to maybe even 1.5, 2 years to try these tooling and technologies to figure out whether it's something that you truly want to go after and invest in.
Yeah, and maybe the piece on, investment. Another thing that I've seen is when you set very specific ROI parameters, this may not be an area that you could invest in, or it's not going to be an area you're going to invest in with certainty. There's so many things we could talk about today. I'm going to put for the side for the moment talent and adoption, because they're both about culture. And I'm going to see if we can get back to that. But maybe Bina, I'm going to come back to you. I'm going to switch it up a little bit and maybe because we were talking so much about the risk side of it. What we haven't really talked about is ethical AI. And this is an area that I know you spend a ton of time on. You and I have spent a ton of time on. You've done a lot of research. How do you think boards can promote ethical Gen AI use and ensure the management is really focused on maintaining trust and transparency throughout the organization? So we've talked a lot about the really good stuff, the risk, but then when you actually get into it, the brand will hang on getting this right. And if we have ethical lapses, that's going to be a real issue. So give us some advice here.
Yeah, and this is one of those new areas which has not come in prior technology waves. Like you look at the cloud wave or even internet, ethics was never associated with technology, right? So AI has brought in one of those nuances to think about ethics and the broader responsibility of using this technology, right? And for it to be successful, it has to be a top-down mandate, one that should be shared between the board and the C-suite and every employee. So it's an essential component of value-driven Gen AI strategy. It cannot be an afterthought because there is just too much at risk if you do not anticipate it. And I think, from a business perspective, the way to think about ethics is more as the side effects, the consequences of using this particular AI tool or solution. How could it impact a certain demographic? How could it impact a certain category of stakeholders? So I think, ethics is one of those nuanced topics that need to come early on. We need to think about, especially if there is human data involved, you need to think about, about fairness and making sure the models that you're using are unbiased, like whether you might be using a simple AI tool to parse through resumes in your HR function, and it might be highly biased towards certain demographics. So how do you think about these soft topics early on and not stop making it an afterthought? This is an area where boards can really lean in because they bring in that outside in perspective. They can look at it from a long-term view and also look at what's happening broadly in the marketplace and help their organization make those right decisions, the right decisions to enforce governance. And one important question that comes up is, whether Gen AI and governance is a topic for the full board, like we've been discussing. And so one of the areas that I've actually seen, and I'm going to say the audit committee as well, is what the companies that are more advanced in their AI journey is having actually a subcommittee within the audit committee to specifically looking at AI auditing, where they are thinking about this newer nuanced risk around ethics, bias, fairness, transparency. These are all areas that traditionally have not existed in the tech space, but now we have to proactively think about it. And we're seeing those subcommittees bringing in those experts to talk about it, to educate, was one of the ways board is moving forward.
And I know at the very beginning of our time together, you talked about the challenges that our companies are facing. And we didn't spend a lot of time because this topic is way longer than an hour.
Yeah.
But one of the things I see a lot is the data and whether the data is actually ready for AI use. And that's the area that we see companies that are getting this right spend the most time on early. There's a very strong relationship then to the ethical AI piece. You need to make sure that the data is representative of all the data points you want to have going in it. So boards asking about data, again, not something I think boards would do, is not getting into management's swim lane, so to say. The data strategy actually will help them have a better AI execution and should be really helpful in getting this ethical AI piece important, which is core to the brand. You don't want to be in the headlines because your AI created outcomes that are not appropriate because you weren't really considering the right AI data.
Another nuance, Lara, if I might add, which many times we skip over, as we all know, data is crucial for AI, but many times it depends on the historical data. You're looking at large amounts of data, historical data. A question for board to ask is, do we really want, the outcomes to be dependent just on historical data and give the similar outcomes? And I'll use the recruitment AI tool example. Historically, women have always been underrepresented in workforce. And if you focus just on historical data, you're going to get recommendations which reflect what the historical data. So what does your organization want to do with that data? Many times it might need to be augmented with synthetic data to make sure, in this case, to make sure there is equal representation in the data.
And that in itself is an ethical question as to what do you want to do, and it's worthy of a conversation. Before we move into the next set of topics, Caroline, I just want to come back to you because we did get a question over the chat, and maybe again taking this broader set of topics and really doing a sit back. The question is, how are boards challenging organizations to put to rest AI concerns related to public perceptions and trust?
Yeah, that's an interesting one. Recently Coca-Cola released a holiday campaign that was an adaptation of a campaign run back in 1995. And there was some backlash from consumers around the nature of that, since a lot of GenAI technology and tools were used, right? And I think this always goes back to the mission of the company and its values. Right. And is everything that we're doing as an organization aligned with that? So related to that campaign, questions came up about whether people in those campaigns or images were real people, whether they were getting paid, and if they were actors, whether they were part of the Screen Actors Guild. Right. So you're getting down to that level of detail and the questions to ask and address within the organization. But in that case, with the backlash, Coca-Cola came out and said, we're creating the highest level of work at the intersection of human creativity and technology. Right. So what is it that you stand by? And be prepared, right, when there is public perception, whether through social media or news outlets, the media that comes back on that, what your policies and ultimately what you stand for is around what you do.
It's a great example of what a board could be doing right now. When I think about these types of things, I don't think of boards, ultimately their responsibility is to say, we're not going to do any of these things. It's never going to happen. It's about preparedness. And right now you could be asking management teams, what are the hard questions they're going to be getting or potentially could be getting because of their strategies, and how would they respond as opposed to in the minute. So it's a great example. I'm going to pull our next polling question up to keep us moving here. The next question is, how are your organizations enhancing Gen AI literacy in the boardroom? And we'll let you guys start to answer that. I did ask you earlier, Caroline, some questions on this, but then I got a follow-up question to the chat that I wanted to maybe ask you while folks are answering. How are board members themselves using AI for greater effectiveness in consideration of their oversight role? Are you seeing board members running the boards that you sit on actually tapping into technologies to enhance their own work?
One of the things we always talk about is using, who do you use, Claude, Gemini, or do you use OpenAI, ChatGPT in your own personal work? So of course, that is to be done. But I think there's more in terms of the expectation for even management to be able to provide kind of real-time data or information leveraging Gen AI tools within the boardroom. There's a lot of materials, right, that get issued a week, 2 weeks in advance, and that's static in nature. And by the time you get to the boardroom, there's new information, new data. And I think there would be a push, right, from the board members to management on leveraging these tools so that board members can be better informed and able to make decisions.
Well, we've now got some of the, thank you for that. We've got some of the polling that's come up, and really interesting. Nearly 40% of board members are actually doing their own. They're going to your Coursera courses. They're doing their own to enhance their knowledge. Their boards themselves have some of the foundational work. And then I see this note on external specialists to discuss it. I know that's something I do. I didn't talk a lot about my own board, but I could just say that Deloitte is a company that leverages a lot of technology. And in my capacity, this is a big part of my role. I'm here to mostly be the moderator, but I'm a big believer in outside voices. So maybe Bina, maybe you could share a little bit, just to get back to you, and just given you're out with companies and clients all the time, how do you see outside voices being leveraged, in boards versus having an internal specialist come in, which is one of the things I mentioned I've also seen. But maybe talk a little bit about the outside expert.
Yeah. So the old approach of having an expert on the board for every strategic area like cybersecurity or finance doesn't work anymore in today's
The board
environment.
will be like the size of an auditorium.
Yes, it would become unsustainably large. And given that boards need to think about which capabilities they need for the organization, they need not only, AI experts, but they probably need even Gen AI, large language model. They need ethics experts. It can just get unwieldy, right? So one approach is to add AI operator onto the board who can bring in these external experts. I certainly go and speak to a number of boards as well as an outside in perspective. But the AI ecosystem is changing so rapidly with new entrants. They are, innovation that's coming from every direction. So bringing in these outside voices gives you a good pulse check on what's happening in the market, what's the latest innovation, what are the latest research, how that could impact your organization, then becomes part of that internal experts. But I think getting both together is the most effective and successful way.
What I've also seen, not a lot, but I would think it's a best practice, boards that do strategy retreats and spend time on, because the boardroom's so busy. Some of the people that I've talked to said the reason we don't talk about Gen AI is we have so many other things to talk about. It's hard for them in and out of meetings to suggest that this is something better. But when I've heard of best practice, it's when they do like a strategy retreat or a time where they get to go deeper, they bring an outside expert in. And they actually have an exercise about how could our business be disrupted. And it's not looking for the Pollyanna aspects of the generative AI. It's actually just challenging, where are the areas that we're most vulnerable, which I think is super fascinating. I'm going to put up our last polling question, and then I want to go back to a topic that we've covered here. At your organizations, what are the planned areas for future Gen AI investment? And maybe while we've got that coming up, I want to go back to you, Caroline. We got a topic that you started to allude to earlier. That Bina, we'll see if you've got anything to add here. The question is, what are the major challenges to companies' talent strategy by Gen AI? And then you talked about the adoption of the Copilot. So I'm going to do the follow-up question. What are employees today worrying about around Gen AI? So Caroline, maybe I'll start with you, and Bina, see if you want to add anything, and then we'll see what this polling question has to say here.
Yeah, I think there are just so many different levels of understanding about Gen AI. In fact, I think many still don't realize that AI has been around. And there's a branch of that called machine learning that has been around to deal with forecasting, pricing, inventory optimization, many existing use cases in finance and supply chain. And what the differences are with that technology, right, versus the latest advancements around Gen AI. So I think just that kind of base level understanding is at different stages within organizations. And companies are still trying to figure out what it is, right? Is it a course? Is it a partnership we need to have with an outside consulting firm to develop educational materials and training for the organization to get better up to speed? And oh, by the way, right, there are different levels within the organization. Do you want leaders to be able to speak a certain language versus those who are more hands-on at different levels within the organization? So I think there's still tackling of that within the talent and the culture piece. And then to your second question, I need you to remind me what that is.
Oh, it was back to, what are employees worried about?
Oh, and I think employees are, over the last 2 years, I've seen with my company, employees are very optimistic about trying different things. But at the same time now, as review committees or maybe kind of AI offices are being put in place, that they're not necessarily doing the wrong thing, right? And they need some guidance around those guardrails or the policies around use and standardization within the organization that they should be following. So I think those are some concerns, in addition to, of course, I think this one that's been talked about quite a bit, which is how could AI potentially, replace certain tasks or work that I do, and what is it that I need to do to continue to provide value to the organization outside of that?
I think what you're all hearing, and again, this is why Gen AI is going to be different than other things boards have seen. There will be an impact to the workforce. The impact is going to come from those that are leveraging it. Are they skilled sufficiently to enable it? There are those that have the responsibility to drive it. Does the management team have enough and the right amounts of those people? And when you start to deal with adoption, is the culture ready to adopt this technology? Or do they get the Copilot and say, I'm not really wanting to use it? Is it because of fear of losing their job, or just fear of knowing how to use it? And will the company, from a value perspective, will it focus on reskilling? And I've also heard a lot of DEI topics come up in this area. Who would likely be the most affected if certain parts of the organization are sought after to go first? So lots of questions around workforce that are very appropriate for boards to ask, and don't sit poorly in a committee. Bina, anything else on talent? Or otherwise, I was going to ask you to reflect with me a little bit on the areas of future use, just given the time you spend on this.
Yeah, I was just going to say, it's, I often get asked the question on what should I study, or is AI going to take my job? And this is what I say, right? It's not AI that's going to take your job. It's a person who knows AI that will take your job, and that is across the board, right, from the board member to the employee. AI fluency, how to use the AI tools in your domain, whether you're working in HR or marketing or as a board member, how you use AI effectively is always going to give you the edge. So,
Well, maybe sticking with that, we lost our areas of focus. I started scanning them, but maybe from your own lens. Oh, there we go. They've got it back up. It was a pretty wide. We let people pick more than one. So it looks like core operations, customer experience, which I've definitely seen a lot of, finance, and technology itself seem to be the areas that where companies will invest, and of course the risk and regulatory, which is so basically everything. It's got a lot. But where do you see the biggest emerging trends coming in this area?
So a few areas that come up. One is the growth of multi-agent systems, where numerous types of data and AI and data are orchestrated, right, to drive entire workflows. We will see LLMs become more persistent and be able to have longer memory. So you're going to see the rise of multi-agent systems. We're probably going to see the continued development of domain-specific LLMs. LLMs will not be at that broad level, but be very specific. If you are an engine manufacturer, you will have an LLM that's trained specifically on that so that you can move faster. And then, obviously, from a tech perspective, we're going to see large-scale providers trying to acquire or build Gen AI capabilities into the whole build versus buy versus partner equation and question will become very much relevant from a tech perspective.
And maybe Caroline, I'll end us with our last question for you. You talked a little bit about the Coca-Cola situation and how you referred back to your values as an organization. This Gen AI again is gonna create tensions relative to choices that companies are gonna make around how they may use it, the pace that they may use it, and ultimately what it means to their value system. I gave this example explicitly about implications to workforce. There will be a temptation to make this a massive technology play to eradicate big chunks of workforce. That may not align with the values of a company. From a board perspective, how do you think boards should be surfacing questions around these trade-offs?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's definitely a tough topic because sometimes these things can spiral very quickly if you're talking about public perception and reputation. But I think it is really understanding what the organization is doing around the use cases related to using Gen AI as a tool and technology. And I think the questions have to be asked around, our policies being put in place, whether it's the employee handbook, right, or it is the AI review committee saying this is how we are going to be putting some guardrails in on using AI. I think those are questions that the board has to stay in tune with and expect the management team to really drive and define that for the company.
Well, I can't believe we're nearing the end of our time, and we've literally scratched the surface of the types of topics that we could be talking about. I think there's going to be a 2.0 version, but maybe Bina, then Caroline, any quick takeaways for our participants before we close out our session?
Become AI fluent. There are a number of resources we've shared throughout, but you can also tap into experts. There are AI tools themselves that can provide you personalized AI training depending on your questions. There are so many opportunities. I think it's about board members taking the initiative and improving their AI fluency.
Okay. Caroline?
And my favorite takeaway is an existential question that a good friend and colleague recently wrote about in an HP article. He's on the board of Kaiser and JetBlue. And that question is, can AI make your product offerings and obsolete? I think that that's a question to ask around obsolescence.
I love it. Well, thank you both. I found the last hour incredibly enriching. I learned something every single time. For all of you that were able to join us, I hope you're spending time on this topic. There's a ton of resources out there, and we from Deloitte are proud partners with all of you, and we'll just love to be on this journey with all of you. All of this comes with amazing opportunity, but it also comes with responsibility, and that sits at the core of a boardroom. So thank you, everybody. Really enjoyed our time together. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, good.